Hello. So as you can see, in the peripheral nervous system, this is where the bulk or where generally all the information comes from and where all the action is executed. So if you take a look at this one, you have your receptors here. On the other hand, you also have your effectors or effectors in the way of your muscle from the CNS to the PNS. You can see that there is a lot of communication ongoing already. So you have communication here within the level of the spinal cord. And then higher up, you also have communication from the spinal cord towards the brain. Okay? So, diba in a company, the executive management, sila yung administration, so they call the shots, the data that is collected gets submitted to them. Right? Similarly, ang data nga din-collect ng receptors is being sent to the brain to allow for processing to happen. And then, di ba, anong inoobra sa company or sa higher ups, di ba, after they receive the data, they take a look at it, and they say nga, oh, this is what we need to do to mediate the situation, di ba? So, after deciding what to do at the level of the brain, instructions will go down to the spinal cord and go to the effector organ. Sa tanatong connections, the functions of the nervous system can actually be summarized in just three words. You have your sensory, your integrative, and your motor. So si sensory is also known as the input because remember, diba, you are receiving, you are sensing, diba? This is where the information comes from. This is where information is collected under the sensory function, under the input function. Or we can also call this as the afferent function. Okay, that's afferent, letter A. Next, so after the information is gathered, after you have sensed that change in homeostasis, it will be sent to your brain, to your spinal cord, to your brain for it to get integrated or to get processed. Now, this is the time that your brain decides what needs to be done with the information that it got from the input. So process, and then eventually it decides on what to do. It sends motor signals. So which is why motor output tawag. Okay, this is the going out instructions from the brain. So kung may afferent, your motor is your efferent. Okay, so take note of this one. And amo na ni siya ang functions of the nervous system in general. Okay, so to put that into perspective, nga daw mas tangible, so take a look at this GIF on top, right? So you're very familiar with this one. This is a reflex. This is your withdrawal reflex that you usually do when you touch something that is painful, right? So as you can see, very quickly, you can pull your hand away. So how does this happen? So if you take a look at the diagram below naman, a similar example is given wherein you are touching the flame of the candle. So that heat, kung madugayan, diba, will actually be felt as pain. Okay, so heat becomes pain. It stimulates your receptors, which is gathering the information. Ano gani next? It sends it along a sensory neuron to get to the CNS, which is either the spinal cord or the brain. So in this case, since from the GIF, diba, it's vital that you pull away quickly because if not, your finger is going to get injured. So as you can see here, if you look closely, diba, the sensory signals get passed on to the spinal cord, right? You see that. At the same time, you also see the signals getting carried upwards towards the brain. Okay? So may ara ang halin sa spinal cord, nga pasaka sa brain. Okay? So as you can see from the spinal cord, nag-give siya yung instructions to the motor neuron to tell the muscle to move your hand away. So very quick ang reaction because the instructions didn't have to come from the brain. pwede na nga sa spinal cord lang for immediate reflexes. Okay? Which is why, ulihin yung nagkakapaminsuran ng una butongan ko, nakamot ko, sakit to gali, di ba? Ulihi ang thought or ang consciousness, una pa ang pull away. Because what happens is that the signal of pain got interpreted and integrated within the spinal cord itself. Okay, so that's what happened. Now let's talk about the organization of the nervous system. So this diagram is a particularly simple one. There are more complicated ones out there, but basically, same lang ilaunod. So when we talk about organization of the nervous system, we actually have two components. You have your central nervous system, which is structurally, anatomically comprised of the brain and spinal cord. And then you have your peripheral nervous system, which structurally contains your cranial nerves. What else? Contains your spinal nerves and your ganglia. Okay, so among structural or anatomical component of the central and peripheral nervous system. Now let's move on to their functional components. So as you can see here, the peripheral nervous system has a sensory and a motor component. So sensory division and the motor division. First, let's talk about sensory. So where can the sensory input come from? So they can come from somatic senses or special senses. When you say somatic senses, this is usually pertaining to that of the joints, of the muscle, and when you say special senses, of course, ang dalanadi is your eyesight, your hearing, your taste. Okay, so all of these can be considered as senses. So once they detect something, a change in stimuli, it informs the central nervous system right away. Okay, so next, you have also the motor output. So the outgoing naman siya yung information. Okay, so take a look at this one. In terms of the motor division, you have your somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. So generally, how are they different? With the somatic, diba, it controls skeletal muscle, which is voluntary movements. Diba? Skeletal muscle for voluntary movements. So the somatic is also for voluntary movements. On the other hand, the autonomic is more on for involuntary function. Okay, under your autonomic, you have your fight or flight response or your sympathetic nervous system. You have your rest and digest or your parasympathetic nervous system. And take a look at what they control. They control smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, all of which are involuntary. Okay, so the ANS, autonomic nervous system, is involuntary. And another subcategory here, very important, is your enteric nervous system, or we call that as your ENS. So ano is the enteric nervous system? So for those who are not familiar with it, the ENS is actually the nervous system of the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, exclusive lang ENS to your GIT. Now let's proceed to parts of the central nervous system in detail. So your CNS consists of the brain and spinal cord, which functions for integration, correlation, and interpretation of the sensory input. It also contains interneurons. So neurons, by the way, are the basic component of the nervous system. So when you say inter, diba, it is connected. So interneurons are the ones that connect or that bridge your sensory neuron to your motor neuron. Okay, interneurons are connecting neurons. What else? So what protects your brain? It is your skull. And from the skull, you have a big foramen called your foramen magnum at the posterior and inferior aspect of the skull, which is where your brain exits to be continuous with your spinal cord. What protects your spinal cord? It is your vertebral column. Your spinal cord, it is found in your spinal canal, or some might call that as your vertebral foramen. You have your peripheral nervous system. So as you can see, peripheral ara sa kilid. Okay, so central is the one in purple. The one in yellow is your peripheral nervous system. So they are merely extensions of your central nervous system. So it consists of somatic and autonomic, as well as enteric nervous system. This is functional classification. Okay, and then what else? So somatic, it's voluntary because mainly you're controlling skeletal muscle. Autonomic is involuntary because you're controlling smooth muscle and cardiac muscle as well as the glands. And the enteric nervous system is also involuntary because you're controlling your gastrointestinal tract organs. What else? It contains your cranial nerves, 12 in total, and your spinal nerves, 31 pairs in total. Okay, so as you can see, the cranial nerves here are extension coming from your brain. Your spinal nerves here are extensions coming from your spinal cord. Your spinal nerves eventually connect with each other sa punta to become your plexuses. So, which is why you have your brachial plexus, lumbosacral plexus, your cervical plexus. So, all of those came from your spinal nerves, which is why if you try to relate it, diba, when you damage any part of your spinal cord, 'di ba, you might think nga, raman mi sa back ang damage, pero nga aga tinggol ang little finger ng patient. 'Di ba? Because it is connected. If there is damage to any part of the spinal cord, then you might manifest with tingling, paresthesia, weakness, pain in your limbs. Because um, the nerves supplying your limbs all originated from your spinal cord. Okay? So it also contains your motor neurons, of course, for movement, and your sensory neurons for sensation. So diin naman yung exit si spinal nerves. So remember, your spinal cord, it's here in your vertebral canal, in your spinal canal. Your spinal nerves, on the other hand, they exit at the side, right? And what you call this foramina again, sa side, it's your intervertebral foramen or intervertebral foramina. So these are your cranial nerves. Please take note of their names. So at this point, I just want you to at least be familiar with the names. So you have your olfactory, you have your optic, oculomotor, trochlear, abducens, trigeminal facial, auditory, or it's also known as your vestibulocochlear, vestibulo for balance, cochlear for hearing, auditory or acoustic as well. Next, you have your glossopharyngeal, your vagus, hypoglossal, and spinal accessory nerve. So please take note of their names and their numbers and their basic functions over here. What protects your nervous system? So we've already talked about your bony protection coming from the skull and the vertebral column. So you might, diba, if you think about it, your brain and spinal cord are very vital components to your body. Like if you damage your brain or if you damage your spinal cord, a lot of functions can cease to exist. So it's important that it is very protected. And grabe man si Lord no mag-design sang bodies and humans. Not only does those important organs have bony protection, it also has another few layers of protection known as your meninges. So these are connective tissues that cover both the brain and the spinal cord, right? So aside sang ginputos sila sang skull, the bone, you also have connective tissue, actually 3 layers of connective tissue covering the brain, right? You call that your meninges, covering the brain, covering the spinal cord. So what are the meninges? So as you can see here, this is an image of the actual brain, and this is your one of the meninges present. As you can see, it's quite thick and it covers the entire brain and it covers the entire spinal cord as well. So the outermost layer is your dura mater, which is actually composed of 2 parts. You have your outer dura and then your inner dura mater. So nga dura mater tawag. So it is the most durable layer because it is the strongest and the outermost layer. Diba? Imagine double layer pa siya o may outer pa kag inner. Its old name used to be Pachymeninx. That's Pachymeninx. That's Pachymeninx or dura mater. So the outer dura mater connected to the skull or was attached to the skull, and the inner one is connected to your spinal cord dura mater. Okay, spinal cord dura mater. Next layer, you have your subdural space. Sub, under, dural. Under the dura, there is a space. Next, you have your arachnoid matter. This is the second meninx or second meningeal layer. So this is the middle layer. Under that, you have your subarachnoid space, sub-under arachnoid space. So ano naman ang vital about the subarachnoid space? This is where the CSF circulates in, or there you stay sa cerebrospinal fluid. Next, you have your pia mater, which is the innermost layer. So all in all, these make up your meninges. Okay. So this is another visualization. Let's take a closer look. So this is for your skull. You have your scalp, you have your cranium, then you have the two layers of your dura. Your periosteal or your outer dura. Periosteal, kiga-connect siya sa bone. And you have your meningeal dura mater, diba? Or inner dura mater, kiga-connect siya sa meninges or sa dura mater of your spinal cord. So papanakog naman siya. In the middle here, you see your superior sagittal sinus. So when you say sinus, this is like a channel or a passageway or gamay siya nga opening, diba? So the significance of your superior sagittal sinus, this is where the CSF will eventually drain into. So tapos yalibot sa brain, sa spinal cord, babalik naman siya kasaka sa brain, and ma-enter siya sa superior sagittal sinus to go back to your blood circulation. Okay? Next layer of the meninges, you have your subdural space, arachnoid matter. Subarachnoid space is important because this is where the CSF circulates. Okay? Then you have your pia mater, it's the innermost, and this is how you eventually get to your cerebral cortex. So it's also the same in your spinal cord. You also have the three layers. Next, let's talk about the early development of the nervous system. So in terms of development, everything, all parts of the body, all organs of the body began from three basic cell layers. So diba, when you were a zygote, a fertilized egg, you underwent cell division until eventually you became a gastrula with the three important layers. So those layers, they differentiated or nag-specialize into different cells that turned into different organs, different tissues, and that's what made up the different systems of your body. So you have three layers, your endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm. So the nervous system actually came from the ectoderm or the most external layer. I want you to take a look at this video.
By day 16, the embryo consists of three layers: endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. Ectoderm develops into the nervous system, and the first phase of this process is known as neurulation. Around day 18, part of the ectoderm begins to thicken. This portion is known as the neural plate, in dark blue, between the cranial end of the embryo and the primitive node. Neurulation is the process of neural plate becoming neural tube. I've got a schematic animation here to try and illustrate that process. We'll break this down day by day throughout the rest of the video. On day 19, the neural plate begins to buckle in the midline. We call this dip the neural groove, and the mounds either side the neural folds. These folds progress toward each other and begin to fuse around day 21. Where they have fused, they form a hollow cylinder, which is the neural tube. Fusion then continues in synchrony toward caudal and cranial ends. The as yet unfused portions are known respectively as the cranial neuropore and caudal neuropore. Pore literally means minute opening. The minute opening at the cranial end closes around day 24, and the caudal end closes around day 26. A particular group of cells reside at the peaks of the neural folds. These are the neural crest cells, which form a layer over the top of the closed neural tube. These develop into most of the peripheral nervous system. To sum up, neurulation is the process of neural plate becoming neural tube. The closure of the neural folds begins in the center and zips up towards either end. The central nervous system is developed from the neural tube. It's worth mentioning that by this gestational age, the embryo has started curving into the fetal position. We've kept the ectoderm flat to keep our schematic version really simple, but these pictures from Gray's Anatomy accurately show the embryo at around 21 and 31 days. The neural tube curves through the back of them, like so. That's it for now. Hit subscribe if you like this video. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.
Okay, so that is the end of the video. So that process was called neurulation. It was where the ectoderm turned into the nervous system. So ano siya yun, miss, di ba? So you have here your primary brain vesicles, forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. So si forebrain, that is your prosencephalon. Si midbrain, that is your mesencephalon. And your hindbrain, that is your rhombencephalon. So from primary, it will divide and become your secondary vesicles. So from 3, naging 5 siya. So si forebrain will further divide into your telen and diencephalon. Your midbrain will still just be your mesencephalon. Your hindbrain will become your meten and myelencephalon, until eventually you get your adult brain structures. So si telencephalon is becoming or will become your cerebral hemispheres in the adult brain. Si diencephalon will become the various thalamus structures, including epithalamus, hypothalamus, and subthalamus. Your mesencephalon will become your midbrain. Your metencephalon will become your pons and cerebellum. And your myelencephalon will become your medulla. So not only will it develop the structures of the brain, it will also develop the different ventricles. It's your ventricular system. So what is your ventricular system? So these are a series or channels of connected ventricles or cavities in the brain which are filled with CSF or cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so let's watch this video.
The cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, is the liquid that bathes the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord. The CSF ensures the protection of the central nervous system against mechanical shocks and vibrations. It plays an important role in the regulation of intracranial pressure. It participates in the cerebral metabolic processes by regulating the exchange of substances and provides many other functions as well. The CSF circulates in two different compartments. The first is the inner brain ependymal cavities, or ventricles. The second is the compartment surrounding the central nervous system. It corresponds to the subarachnoid space. The CSF is secreted by the choroid plexus, clusters of capillary blood vessels located in the ventricular system. The ventricular system consists of 4 ventricles connected by many channels. It is connected to the central canal of the spinal cord. There are 2 lateral ventricles, occupying the center of the cerebral hemispheres. Both are connected to the 3rd ventricle at the center of the diencephalon by the foramina of Monro. The 3rd ventricle is connected to the 4th ventricle in the brainstem by the aqueduct of Sylvius. The CSF will leave the 4th ventricle through the foramen of Meninges to fill the subarachnoid space between the pia-mater and the arachnoid. The CSF is then absorbed at the top of the skull by the arachnoid granulations of Pacchioni.
So now let's take a look at the pictures presented. So this is a lateral and an anterior view of the brain and its ventricles. So you have here the first is your lateral ventricles. So these are paired ventricles here at the front. So take note, all ventricles have what you call as your choroid plexus. So these are a compilation, or these are a collection of capillaries, choroid plexus, that are able to produce cerebrospinal fluid. So this means that in the lateral ventricles, in the 3rd ventricles over here, so this one is 3rd, this one is 3rd, and in your 4th ventricles, each of these ventricles can form CSF. Okay, so as it flows downwards, some more CSF gets added up. Okay, what else? So from the video, I think you've heard of the term aqueduct of Sylvius. Which is another name for cerebral aqueduct. You might also call it as aqueduct of Sylvius. What else? You also have here your interventricular foramen. So the other name for interventricular foramen is your foramen of Monro. Okay? Or sometimes some people spell it with an E. You also have here another representation lang. So just remember, within the subarachnoid space is where the CSF stays. Okay, subarachnoid space. What else? I wanted to take note of your superior sagittal sinus. So the SSS contains your contains your arachnoid villi. Arachnoid villi. So just understand my handwriting. The SSS contains arachnoid villi, which will drain or which will reabsorb the CSF. Okay, so take note, SSS contain arachnoid villi to drain the CSF. So take a look at your arachnoid villi. It's this one here. It's to absorb. And your arachnoid villi is found in your superior sagittal sinus. Next, let's talk about the fluid within the ventricles. It's your CSF. So your CSF is another protective layer. So aside sa bony protection, sa connective tissue protection by the meninges, you also gonna have a fluid protection, which is your CSF. So normally, CSF is colorless, it's odorless, and should not contain blood. Now let's go to the functions of the CSF. It's for protection, cushioning, and buoyancy. We already know that. Diba? Given that your brain is tissue that is soft, contained in a hard skull, if mabunggo lang ang brain sa skull due kay ma-bruise or mahubag ang brain. Diba? So that's important nga this is CSF to keep to keep your brain afloat and para may Japon buffer before siya magbunggo sa skull. Okay, it regulates the ions that go in and out of the brain. It regulates by removing waste products because your brain, remember, does not have lymphatic vessels which drain waste product away. Instead, the CSF does that function. It removes the waste products of the brain. You might also call that as removal of metabolites. But else, it's also a pathway for nutrients to get to the brain. You start with the choroid plexus in each of the ventricles. So specifically, begin with the lateral ventricle to the interventricular foramina or the foramina of Monroe, diba? Then you have your third ventricle. You have your cerebral aqueduct or your aqueduct of Sylvius, all the way next to your fourth ventricle. From there, you flow out to two lateral apertures, or these are your foramen of Luschka, going downwards to your spinal cord. And then you have one median aperture, letter M. This is your foramen of Magendie. Okay, so after that, it circles down to your spinal cord, to the subarachnoid space, and then it goes back up to the brain where it gets reabsorbed in the superior sagittal sinus by way of your arachnoid villi. Okay, sorry sila. And that is the end of the circulation of the CSF. Also very important, you have barriers between the blood and the brain. Why is this important? Because it needs to be regulated what gets to cross the barrier. Because your brain is very important in function. Just a little bit of disturbance in the homeostasis can greatly alter your cognition, your motor skills, and your sensory ability. So this is why it needs to have a barrier. Okay, so it's not completely na hindi kalabay ang anything. It's just that it's highly regulated within the blood-brain barrier. So only certain substances can pass through. You also have your blood-CSF barrier, so it functions the same thing. Now let's talk about common medical disorders. Number one, you have your hydrocephalus. So this is the MRI of a normal ventricle, normal brain with normal ventricles, and this is one with hydrocephalus. So if you notice, the ventricles are dilated. So hydrocephalus is the pooling of water in the head. Okay, so damo water or cerebrospinal fluid in the head. And we usually see naga-expand or enlarge gid ang skull or ang head in the infants, but in the adult, it is also possible to get hydrocephalus, but since the adult skull is not as pliable, hindi na maghabok as big. Okay, remember, diba, in the children, in the infants, hindi pa na-fused ilang skull, which is why changes in the ventricles, changes in the size of the brain, if mag-enlarge siya, can greatly affect ang external na appearance ng skull. Okay, because pwede pa siya ka-enlarge, maka-adapt pa siya kumbaga sa pressure. Okay, so this is just another representation. The next condition is your Chiari malformation. So what happens with this one? So this could also happen in addition to hydrocephalus. Okay, what happens is that there is a downward displacement of the inferior parts of the cerebellum. So diba remember, RDC foramen magnum, right? The lobes of foramen magnum should be the spinal cord. Above it should be the brain. But in a Chiari malformation, what happens is that do nagka-hernia bala, nagpanaog, balik ang dalom nga parts ng cerebellum into the spinal cord. Okay? So that might cause certain disruptions in function as well. So that is it for the topic for Module 1, Lessons 1 to 4. Thank you for listening, everyone. God bless.